Okay, to start, I'm just going to indicate a few strokes to place the central form. I always start with a dark color, and what I've done here is just mixed equal parts of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. Get a nice dark color which I can indicate some of the shadow passages. So now I'm developing the side form or supporting form on the left-hand side. I like to block in without doing a drawing so that I can be kind of free and to explore shapes. And it's important to do the larger shapes first and not worry about any of little fussy details. This is an important step in keeping the painting really loose and free and spontaneous. So you can see right now I'm painting rather quickly, and I'm not overly critical about what I'm doing. I'm being pretty free with the strokes and what I'm doing. If I need to draw in some passages, I'll just use the corner of the 1-inch watercolor brush. So I'm slightly modifying the paint every time I mix it. I'm not trying to mix the exact same color each time. It probably doesn't show up in the camera, but some areas are slightly cooler, some are slightly warmer. And just having a little bit of subtle variety like that will make the painting feel much more natural. So over the years I've developed this technique based largely on my experiences painting outdoors and observing things directly from nature. And you kind of develop this shorthand way or a quicker way of expressing certain ideas. And so I'm carrying a lot of that knowledge over into the science fiction or imaginative realm. But really the underlying techniques are very much the same as if I were to approach a cityscape painted on location, or to approach a rural landscape or anything like that. So as I'm designing these forms, one of the things that's going through my head at this time is looking at the spacing between things, making sure that the distances are unequal. I always think about kind of a 1/3, 2/3 sort of thing. Now what I'm doing, I initially used the watercolor brush, and what I like to do is grab the 6-inch squeegee and modify some of those strokes. And what it does is just adds a little bit different and much broader stroke than I could achieve with a brush, and also takes some of the brushiness out of the strokes. So it's a nice way to unify some of those shadow shapes. So now I'm going back with the watercolor brush again, and with the mixture of paint, I add a lot of Gamsol, which is basically an odorless mineral spirit. The reason why I like Gamsol is it has a much slower evaporation rate, and for one thing, it won't kill you as fast as other products out there, just because it's not evaporating, and getting into the airstream as quickly. But the other thing that's nice about it is it gives me a longer working time. So this paint is very wet right now, and it can be easily pushed around and even wiped out if I need to. Because once the paint dries, or once the Gamsol evaporates out of the paint, then it will become much stiffer, and it's much more difficult to manipulate at that point. So it's really nice here to stay. It stays pretty wet. Kind of the basic framework that I'm thinking about as I'm designing this is that there are these long sort of shapes, these columns, and then within those columns I have some circular elements in the columns. And what that does is you have the straight lines, the squarish sort of shapes balanced with the curves, and so for abstract purposes, that's something that they can play off each other in an interesting sort of way. Now I've just grabbed along with a squeegee, I'm just using a 1-inch rubber spatula, and basically it allows me to carve out some of the paint that I've laid down. So it gives you an indication of how wet that it actually is. I can pull out some of that darker color and basically refine the drawing a little bit by erasing. It's kind of like an erasing tool that you'd have in Photoshop. All right, we'll skip ahead a little bit here. What I'm doing now is I'm starting to develop some of the areas in the light. And so I've just taken a mixture of titanium white and a little bit of cad yellow and cad orange, and mix those into the darker color that I have for the shadow area. I mix a little bit of that darker color into the light just so that they relate to one another. So what I'm doing is kind of an average mid-tone value in the light, but making sure that it separates clearly from the shadow side. Because what I'm going to ultimately do is start to develop some of the form shadows as they go from the light into the shadow parts of the canvas. There's going to be kind of this fine gradation that needs to occur in order to make that form feel round. So as I'm using the 1-inch watercolor brush, I kind of use it in an expressive way. I hold it in different ways. I use the corners, use the flat end, also the sides. And there's a lot of different ways you can use the brush in order to get a more variety in the textures and the designs that you're doing. So I'm kind of unconsciously thinking about that as I'm looking to build the light. And what I've decided is that I'm going to have the light coming from the top left-hand side and going down towards the lower right. And what that does is having the light go in kind of a diagonal sort of way, it adds a dynamic element to an otherwise static straight up and down form. So it's just a way to add kind of dynamic angles into the work. So as the light kind of rakes across the form right here, I'm adding highlights on the planes that, or a lighter touch on the planes that are facing more towards the light. And the planes that are starting to face away from the light, even though they are still lit, they will be more of a halftone. So I'm going back and forth between a squeegee and the brush. Again, this kind of creates a little bit more organic type of structure rather than just using the same brush. You want to have kind of a mixture of elements or a mixture of tools so that you can create some variety. This will make the object feel a little bit more, well, a lot more natural than if you were just using one type of brush. Now I grab some ultramarine blue and phthalo blue and dip a lot or put a lot of Gamsol into it so that it's really like painting watercolor, and so it's really drippy, wet paint. And what I'm doing is just getting a tone back in the distance so that I can start to create some atmosphere in the painting. And I'm coming along with a squeegee just to keep the paint really thin back there. So one of the reasons why I create the initial form and then come back and paint the background around the form is because I want that initial form to set up a little bit and to stiffen, and that happens because of the evaporation, as well as the gesso, acrylic gesso will absorb some of that oil paint. And this will allow me to leave some edges around these main columns, these dark forms, and when I want to, I can add a little bit more Gamsol and then soften them here and there. But if I want to, I can paint right up to that edge and keep them nice and sharp. So it gives me greater variety of edge quality if I paint the central form first and then come around and modify things in the distant background. So if I were doing a plein air or outdoor landscape painting, very often I'll paint in maybe the distant mountain range and then come back later and then do the sky at the very end, just like I'm kind of doing here with this background area. All right, now that I've got the background kind of laid in for the most part, I'm going to start to see what I can do to add more interest into this central form. So this area, this circular thing, it's because of its placement and its size, it is a natural area for a focal point. But what I want to do is add some interest within that circular form. If I left it just open like that, it may not. It's too strong of a shape, so I need to cut into it, and that's what I've done here. And now I start to develop some of the light around that form as well. So I'm using a little bit thicker paint, and I keep the shadows thin, but as I'm developing the lights, I'll slowly add thicker paint. And what that means really is less Gamsol until ultimately I won't be using any at all, so I can build up the lights. And for painting like this, if it is shown in a gallery setting, it just looks better when it's being lit by a gallery light. What will happen is the lighter passages will, since they're very opaque, light will bounce off of them and make those areas appear like they have even lighter values than I can physically put in paint. And then the shadow areas, since they stay thin, light will get absorbed, and it will keep the glare out of those areas and stay darker. So these are important principles that have been used for a long time by traditional painters. Probably the most notable would be Rembrandt. If you look at maybe one of his paintings, a famous painting, The Golden Helmet, you'll notice on close inspection how thick the highlights are on the light side of that golden helmet, and then on the shadow side of his face and the helmet, it gets much thinner. So he's discovered that once the painting was lit properly, it would enhance the value contrast. Okay, now I start using a smaller brush, and using a small, like a 00 brush, and this one's a little round that I'm using. What I do is I can modify some of these smaller, these little passages and add a little bit of subtlety here and there. And that's what I'm trying to balance, is the really bold, strong strokes with strokes that are a little more delicate. And so what you're playing is these little touches with these big broad areas. So with this smaller brush, I'm not only working in the lights, but I also go into the shadow value and carve out some of these little shadow forms, adding complexity to the scene. Now it's really easy to get carried away with a lot of these little strokes, and so, again, I'll go back with a bigger brush and maybe take out some of them. There's definitely a back and forth that has to happen. So you'll see me go back with a big brush and then to a small brush, just back and forth until I get that right, a nice balance, a nice mix of the two. So right now I'm modifying some of the shadows, the edges of the shadows as they rake across uneven forms. What they'll do is they'll create little crevices that go beyond the straight diagonal of the shadow form. Now if it was if this column that I was painting was smooth, maybe if it was a spaceship and it just had a smooth skin over it, I wouldn't have any of that to deal with. But since we're dealing with forms that have these bumps and grooves and things like that, what I need to do is kind of modify them. I'm also adding some of these strokes that go from column to column. They're ropes or maybe wires, things that indicate that there's some sort of structure. What it does is helps connect the forms, and it adds more interest into the painting by having these wispy kind of and sinewy shapes, almost like a spider's web. And just adding things like that may add a little bit of narrative, but also it adds some flow, visual flow from one shape to another. So I'm taking a little extra care in and around the focal point to develop or to further strengthen the that main little structure that's in this circular space. Then I'm also developing little touches of light so that these forms not only have the big shapes, but they have secondary shapes within them, and then even tertiary shapes. And adding the varying degrees of these types of shapes, what it will do is add scale to the piece, as well as the visual interest. Now I'm creating again a couple of these little wires or spindly sort of things, and to some degree it's just a stylistic choice. To another degree it's to render these or to connect these forms in a visual way. You can imagine these tubes are something where creatures of some sort live, or they're it's kind of like maybe it's a place where they hibernate, or but you can see there's some sort of technology going on in the way that they're with these wires and these ropes and things like that. But I like to keep a little bit of mystery as to what exactly it all is and means. For the most part, I'm really exploring visual, just some visual ideas that kind of look cool for their own sake, and they don't necessarily need to. I don't necessarily feel like I need to spell it out perfectly about what the narrative is, but because my central concern is making something that works on a visual level, on an abstract level. So if I rotated this piece upside down, which I like to do so that I can see how everything's working, or rotate it to the side, or look at it in a mirror to flip it horizontally or vertically, and see how it works, what edges are jumping out when they shouldn't, and that sort of thing. I want to make sure that it works on an abstract level where it doesn't matter which orientation the painting is. The design, the feeling of light and atmosphere should work no matter which way it's going. All right, now I'm using a palette knife, and what I like to do with the palette knife, what it allows me to do is really load the paint up. So I'm using straight paint at this point, and putting some thicker globs of paint on the canvas. And if you've seen a John Singer Sargent painting, one thing that he does, if you look at the jewelry of the portrait paintings that he's done, they have these really thick globs of paint on the rings or necklaces and things like that, and they really pop out. And so I'm giving this scene a little bit of a glittery, jewel-like surface in order to kind of pop it out from the canvas. And that's one thing that's a real advantage that a traditional painting has over maybe a digital one. I think the general criticism is often that it feels very flat, but it's something that you can, here in a traditional setting, you can really make it pop out in a three-dimensional sort of way just by the actual paint, where you're almost sculpting with it, or at least it's like you're spreading frosting around. Now with all these little touches that I'm doing, sometimes I'll use the side of my pinky finger to modify them, or I'll use, again, go back to the brush and take some of them out. because you have that tendency to put a lot of things in, and then you have to come back with with that you have to rein in your enthusiasm and take out half of what you put in, and you really don't know how much to put in unless you just go for it. Put in too much and then go back and see how you can edit it out and modify it. So now I'm going to go on this side of on the right hand side of the central column, and I'm going to edit out some of these areas that have gotten a little too busy. At this stage in the painting, I'm painting a lot slower and a lot more thoughtful in the way I'm looking at the design. I spend a lot of time staring at it. And what I found in my analysis that this right side of the column was getting a little too busy. It had too much going on, and so I'm trying to simplify it a bit. So I'm just using a number 6 brush. This is a synthetic hog bristle brush, and I really like this one. This one's in particular is made by Rosemary & Co. They're a company out of England, and they make these nice synthetic hog bristle brushes. They last a lot longer than your typical hog bristle brush, and also no animals were harmed in the making of the brush too, which is nice. So I'm just thoughtfully carving out the contours, cleaning up some of the edges. Some of them tend to get a little bit messy, and so I just want to make sure that there's a certain amount of readability in the piece. Now, it's my inclination to have scenes or prefer paintings that have a lot of complexity to them. I know there are some artists that prefer much more simplicity in their work, and certainly there's definitely a strength to that. But for me, I like to have some interesting nuance and action, even mystery created by not trying to define everything and letting some of those areas be a little bit visually ambiguous. So what I'm doing here is I'm designing or carving out some negative space, so the more distant area, which would probably either be the sky, or if this was underwater, it would be the distant areas of ocean or something like that. And what that does is, by breaking these areas up, it also will create, you see I have kind of this diagonal going through close to the center of the canvas, where you have these light spots that are helping to work your eye and also reinforce that feeling of light that's coming through the upper left and creating a diagonal. So I'm adding a little bit more of a kind of an echo of that diagonal in the distance. And the reason why I want to do that is I don't want your eye to just go straight up and down the painting. I want it to weave back and forth through the painting. And so I'm adding these visual cues so that you do that you have more of a zigzagging motion than just a straight up and down. So down at the bottom of the canvas, I'm indicating just a slight hint of some sort of horizon. I don't want to be too literal about it, but what it can do is give you a subtle cue about where you are viewing this piece, that you're above, you're up high somewhere. And the horizon is below you. All right, now I'm going back, and with all those little subtle things I've done with a tiny brush and with the palette knife, I'm going to go back and kind of fuse some of them together, especially up and around or near the focal point. I kind of went a little bit over the top with too many little forms and stuff like that, and I need to, if you break up all the forms to be the same size, then it loses interest. So I go back to a larger brush and broaden out some of those things. So I just modified that area up above to feel like it goes from light into shadow. Adding those kind of subtle things will really help it give a much more believable and much more convincing sense of light. Now, as I'm adding these tiny details and things like that, one thing you'll notice on the left hand or the right hand side is that that column that gets cut by the right edge of the canvas, it is a little bit paler than it will actually appear when you varnish the painting. So what I do is, before I call it finished, I spray it with a retouch varnish, and that will help establish or get those shadow values vibrant again. But I need to wait a day or so to make it dry.